So, the recently announced shutdown of Nintendo and Cygames' collaboration mobile game project, Dragalia Lost, has put a bit of a spotlight on Nintendo's mobile offerings. So the timing seemed appropriate to look at another one of their middling games on the platform.
Pokémon Masters EX!
And by middling, I mean not nearly on the level of Fire Emblem Heroes or Pokémon Go, the two games that seem to carry Nintendo's mobile division. I need to preface this in that I do not think that Pokémon Masters is in any immediate danger of hitting that dreaded end of service. While it is hard to find exact and comprehensive statistics, especially since Pokémon Company kinda does its own thing separate from the rest of Nintendo, we do know that the game is performing decently well and sees steady revenue with nice spikes where we'd expect them to occur, like around anniversary events and major character releases. So while it is probably a stretch to say that the game is struggling, it definitely hasn't made quite the splash in the mainstream as some other gacha games have. Content React streamers who aren't quite in the loop during the Pokémon Masters segments on the Pokémon Presents live streams will usually say something along the lines of, "This game is still around?" or "How did they mess up a Pokémon gacha?" So this calls for a closer look into Pokémon Masters EX, formerly just known as Pokémon Masters. They added the EX tag around the game's anniversary, and much to the amusement of Twitter.com users, the hashtag could be read as Pokémon Master Sex, boosting the game into the mainstream social media sphere for possibly the first time since the game's launch for a nice 15 minutes of fame, albeit for dubious reasons. It's fun to come up with conspiracy theories that the devs knew exactly what they were doing with this, but that's an awfully big commitment for a questionable joke. So first things first, the obligatory quick overview. Pokémon Masters EX is a gacha game based on Pokémon, meaning free to start and laden with microtransactions. You summon for sync pairs, which are trainers from the main series Pokémon games, paired up with a designated Pokémon. The main gameplay loop will be creating team compositions of 3 of your sync pairs and doing battles in a real-time RPG format. The game features a large cast of trainers and Pokémon from all 8 main series generations, as well as alternate and seasonal versions of these characters, as is the standard fare for gacha games. Before I go into my theories of why the game hasn't resonated with people as much as it maybe could have, let's go over some of the things that it does well, because personally I do enjoy the game and do have nice things to say about it. So for starters, I believe the most egregious part of the game is inherently that it is a gacha, but all things considered, the gacha aspect of Masters is pretty solid, relatively speaking of course. I know most gacha gamers will huff their copium and go to bat for their respective games of choice and say how their game is the most free-to-play friendly of them all, but I do genuinely believe that Pokémon Masters EX does have one of the better systems out there. The default 5-star character summon rate is a whopping 7%, going up as far as 12% on certain limited character banners. This comes with the caveat that the rate-up character is much lower rate, like at 1 or 2%. But even still, the decent income of gems rewarded for playing the game and logging in means that a normal player will at the very least be able to amass a solid roster of general pool 5-star characters. There's also fail-safes in place, such as Scout Points, which let you spark for a character of your choice after a certain amount of gems spent on rolls for a specific banner, and upgrade candies, which can be used to act as a duplicate copy of a character. And if you really wanted to go down that dark route, there are often discounted gem bundles offered for those who are willing to crack open the wallet. Now, despite the generally favorable review I just gave, it still is a gacha game, meaning that the usual warnings still apply wholeheartedly. The gacha system is, by nature, predatory, and Masters does come with its fair share of mechanisms to tempt the players. For instance, rolling duplicate copies of characters is very important, as it is the only way to expand a sync pair's sync grid, basically a way to power up your characters and unlock extra stats and skills. While you can use the candies, they are handed out sparingly, and it's always going to be faster to just drop some gems for summons. Additionally, while I wouldn't say power creep is a huge factor, there are a lot of limited characters that only stick around during certain events or holidays, and a lot of them are some of the strongest characters in the game. So you gotta spend for them, lest you be subjected to FOMO. Thankfully, Gacha isn't the only way to get characters, as you do get a few free-to-play characters from the main story, as well as some from the legendary events, which can be completed at your leisure. Some of the legendaries are quite competent units even in the context of endgame battles. For instance, Professor Sycamore and Xerneas are a high-tier support sync pair, whereas Giovanni and Mewtwo are pretty good DPS. They won't be outperforming the hyper-limited Gacha units most of the time, but they'll get the job done well enough. This transitions nicely into the next point, being the gameplay. While there are mixed opinions on the battle system, I do think it works pretty well for what it's trying to do. It borrows a lot from the main series Pokemon games with the stats, type charts, and moves, but it mixes it up quite a bit. Instead of being purely turn-based, you get an action bar that fills in real time based on your speed stat, with stronger moves requiring more of the bar to use. Typing is also a little bit different in that each Pokemon only has one weakness selected from its actual type chart weaknesses. So you got Lucas with Dialga, for instance. Well, its weakness is designated as fighting, so it won't be taking super effective damage from ground type moves as it would in a regular Pokemon game. While the actions are mostly simplified from the mainline Pokemon games, you have multiple passive abilities to factor in for each Pokemon as well, which can range from things like boosting stats in certain conditions to surviving lethal damage with 1 HP once per battle. So while I was skeptical of the real-time nature of the battles at first, I do think it can be fun once you have proper team compositions made. And of course, if waiting for the bar to fill so you can perform your attacks is too slow, there's always the speed up toggle that can be activated at any point in the battle, as well as an auto battle function that barely works, but it's there for the lazy, I guess. It saw a lot more use before they added the ability to skip repeated quests, that's for sure. The nice thing about Pokemon Masters is that it does provide a legitimate challenge at times with certain game modes like Legendary Arenas and Champion Stadium. These modes pit you against tough opponents with multiple levels of difficulty and make use of multiple team comps. While they can be cleared off-type, it does incentivize having at least one damage dealer to cover each type in the game. The Champion Stadium even has certain difficulty modifiers that you can toggle on and off and customize to your liking, with more difficult settings netting bigger rewards. And here lies one of the strengths of Pokemon Masters. It manages to provide a decent challenge for those who want it without being overly annoying or tedious, and without relying on PvP aspects that would excessively reward the heavy spenders. The rewards for clearing the single-player content on maximum difficulty versus more reasonable difficulties also don't usually vary too much, meaning that the intense battles are mostly for people actually seeking the challenge itself. This is a difficult balance for a lot of gacha games to strike, but I do believe Masters handles it with relative grace. Well, there was that one prestige event with a global ranking system, but we don't really talk about that one. And they never really brought it back since the initial run either. Finally, the game does sport a nice deal of polish in its presentation. While the art style is nothing to write home about, using the 3D models and animations we've been used to since the 3DS days, the trainers are rendered quite nicely at least, and even if the 3D models lack some of the charm and flair that other gachas use with 2D drawn portraits, they do look good, and some of the unique outfits to the game are rather stylish. The music is pretty solid though, featuring unique remixes of most of the battle themes from across the generations, while some of the rearrangements for the iconic themes can be a bit jarring to hear. The soundtrack is overall pretty nice. Finally, Pokemon Masters does feature English voice acting, a somewhat sparse amount, but a welcome addition nonetheless, considering how the home console Pokemon games have been sorely lacking it. Now that we've listed some of the strong points, it's time to dig a little bit into some of the areas of weakness that hold Pokemon Masters EX back a bit. If you're looking for strong arguments backed up by cold hard facts and logic, well, these are probably going to be more in the realm of theories and anecdotes, so you might not agree with all the speculation laid out, but I've been following the game since before launch, so I'd like to think I've picked up a few things here and there. One of the most glaring weaknesses right off the bat would have to be the story and writing. Pokemon is not necessarily a series that has been known for consistently having the most compelling stories and plot lines, but it is an aspect people do pay attention to, especially when it comes to gachas and you got heavily text-based games like Grand Blue Fantasy and Fate Grand Order as kind of the old guard of the genre. The first story arc of the game, the Pokémon Masters League, can basically be summed up as a generic tournament story arc that serves as a roundabout way for players to recruit free characters. For over a year, the story chapters would follow a basic formula of meet new character, do an easy battle, character joins your roster. To its credit, the original antagonist, Lear, does eventually get a compelling character arc, but overall it does feel kinda lacking, especially since the game is somewhat of a celebration of all the past main series Pokemon titles. Some of the side events do get neat moments that focus more heavily on a small select pool of characters, but even then they feel pretty formulaic, heavily leaning on the same themes of deepening the bonds between trainer and Pokemon through battle. But one of them takes place on Christmas, or maybe on the beach. It's definitely not all bad. There are some fan service moments or character interactions that expand on where the main series games were lacking, like conversations between N and Gestus, or Sycamore and Lysander, for instance. And the new story arc, the villain arc, which focuses each section on a specific generation's heroes and villains, is a lot more in-depth and engaging, which is a great positive upwards trend for the game. But overall, it does feel like more could have been done, and the sheer blandness of the game's initial chapters and early events certainly didn't help. Which leads right into the next point. Pokémon Masters EX had a pretty rocky launch. While it wasn't bad enough to kill the game, and gacha games having rough starts is pretty standard all things considered, first impressions do matter at least a bit, and this one wasn't great. For starters, gem distribution was quite stingy back then, but it also didn't feel great because the summoning pool wasn't exactly super exciting either. Looking back at the first wave of 5-star characters in the gacha pool, you got Phoebe and Dusclops, Brendan and Trico, Chris and Totodile, Olivia and Lycanroc, and Karen and Houndoom. Not necessarily a terrible lineup, but likely lacking in star power, especially since evolutions weren't a thing yet either, so that meant no Sceptile, no Dusknoir, etc. I know it's important to save your heavy hitters and space them out, but initial trailers and promotional material and even the loading screen featured big name characters like Red, N, Steven, and Cynthia, and none of them were present in the game until months later. But gacha woes pale in comparison to the bigger problem, and that being just a lack of fun content. As mentioned earlier, the initial story chapters were pretty trash, and the main gameplay loop in the endgame was farming co-op battles for rare drops. Nowadays, co-op is barely even an afterthought outside of specific events, especially since they reworked it so you can just bring 3 of your own squads to most co-op enabled quests. But back then, the game more or less revolved around co-op, and people generally didn't look upon it too favorably. It was a pretty slow system, and if your team didn't have the best 5-star characters at the time, it was very possible that your group could just wipe. It wasn't uncommon for a co-op party to just be 3 players with Blue or Olivia or whoever was meta for most fights. That brings me to the next point, which is that the game just simply didn't have a strong grasp of a target audience. Pokémon Masters EX doesn't exactly cater perfectly to either gacha gamers or longtime core Pokémon fans. I believe something like Fire Emblem Heroes is more compatible with the core Fire Emblem fanbase because Fire Emblem is a largely character-driven series. The characters get fleshed out personalities through support conversations and story events, and that gets players to resonate with their favorites on a much deeper level, which of course translates to another reason to drop cash. That isn't to say that Pokemon trainers don't have their fans, because they definitely do, but the attachment for most people is probably on a more casual level. That's only fair since Pokemon has been more about the creatures rather than the trainers. The Pokemon themselves are the ones you take into battle, and at that point, wailing for the same 3D model of Charizard or whatever just doesn't hit quite the same. The core Nintendo fanbase has typically been pretty outspoken about being against microtransactions and mobile games and the like. So while it's probably a vocal minority situation, it was pretty hard to imagine the Pokemon community celebrating a gacha game of all things. And on the other side of the coin, the members of the gacha gaming communities, the ones who download all the big free-to-start games to re-roll from meta units on day one just to try them out, probably didn't find the game suited to their tastes either. While the good gacha rates are a boon, and being based on a large pre-existing IP ensured a certain level of polish and stability, there wasn't a lot to keep the window shoppers around. The game's visual identity was also seen as somewhat bland and generic, which didn't help as that's usually a huge hook for drawing in new players. While a lot of that could be attributed to the aforementioned scuff to launch, even after a lot of those issues were gradually improved, there wasn't a lot to make habitual gotchaers commit to the game over others, unless they were already Pokemon fans, of course. Especially at launch, there were some pretty telltale signs that, at least to a certain extent, an attempt to coast off the Pokemon brand name was made. And that brings us to the final main point, the gameplay system. This one is largely subjective, but I'll try to be somewhat analytical here. A lot of people didn't exactly vibe with the battle system presented in Pokémon Masters. The gameplay, at its core, deviates heavily from mainline Pokémon games, but at the same time borrows just enough to where it feels recognizable but also alien. This might be nitpicky, but it does feel wrong doing things like hitting flying types with earthquakes since there's no resistances or immunities. And the stats are named the same, you got your speed, special attack, special defense, etc., but are very arbitrarily redistributed, so you get oddities like Morpeko having significantly better offensive stats than Mega Rayquaza, or Yamper being tankier than things like Probopass and Bronzong. Now, spin-off games taking creative liberties with stats is nothing new. After all, Squirtle isn't exactly the speed demon that Smash Bros. Makes him out to be, but it's that vague proximity to the mainline games that makes it all the more jarring. All of that, however, could be overlooked if the systems in general felt good to play, but for a lot of people, Pokémon Masters just kinda missed the mark. Going back to the game's launch, doing quests for the resources you needed was extremely grindy and repetitive, but for little payoff. The auto battle feature being extremely underwhelming did not really help matters in that regard either. Later on, they streamlined the grindiness of the game by adding skip tickets for repeatable quests, but at the cost of tacking on a stamina system. Now, to be fair, stamina gating players has been a feature present in most other free-to-play games, but when Masters didn't have one in place at launch, it did rub some people the wrong way. So ultimately, what it really boiled down to the most was that Pokémon Masters EX just wasn't really what a lot of players were looking for. Pokémon isn't entirely incompatible with the mobile format, as evidenced by Pokémon Go, but that game was much more simple and appealed much more broadly to nostalgia, while also having a less overtly predatory monetization model. I do think the idea of focusing more heavily on the trainers from the series is a great idea, since they do have their fans, as evidenced by the mountains of fan art that a lot of them get, despite having very few lines of dialogue in the main series games. It is difficult to imagine how the game could have translated over better to the mainstream Pokemon fans, however. Perhaps it might have been neat if they positioned it more as a mainline mobile Pokemon adventure, with the player being able to visit the regions from the main game as well, instead of confining it to the original island of Pasio. That is somewhat similar to what they're trying to do with the villain stories, it seems, after all, and that was a big step forward for the game. Adding in some more features from mainline, like player character and team customization, could also help the game feel more palatable to Pokemon fans. Egg Pokemon did help somewhat, but they're almost all obsolete, and it doesn't feel great using the generic protagonist character. I get that with these kinds of mobile gacha games, making the character as generic of a self-insert as possible is the gold standard, but it sometimes feels like your character is pretty inconsequential to everything that's going on, which runs against the overall theme of Pokemon games, which heavily emphasize the player's own personal journey. Well, all that being said, Pokémon Masters has vastly improved from launch, with the game getting expanded and improved on regularly. While many people have written it off, it's had a pretty major and necessary glow-up in almost all aspects. It is hard to recommend since it is a gacha game, and you really aren't missing too much by not playing it, since it does kind of run into the issue of, well, why don't you just play a regular Pokemon game? But if you're the kind of player who quit shortly after launch and are curious, or perhaps don't mind the mobile gacha game format, I do think it is definitely worth picking up and trying out. Due to the relatively casual nature of it, it does work well as a side game. I know I was kind of harsh on it at points, but I do like the game and I do play it somewhat regularly, so it was kind of fun to reflect on how things used to be. A lot of the common criticisms don't hold up quite as well when considering the improvements made throughout the game's life cycle, and while some of them still do, for sure, it's always nice seeing a game with promise or a cool premise manage to find its footing and evolve over time. Well, that's the video. Thanks for watching, And let me know if you play Pokemon Masters EX.